So I'm going to talk about how computer vision traditional approach is not enough if we want to bring the grab to real applications and robotics. So in a more realistic setting, what will happen is like people will not stick to a predefined set of vocabulary or predefined set of labels that we have in our cases. So if we want to build a more natural language interface, we have to be able to handle variations in which users refer to the objects in their environment. As you will see in a moment, when you have a more complex scene like this, people tend to refer to the objects using many different kinds of words. Some of them will use brands, some of them will use categories, some of them will use adjectives. So if we want to be able to solve a more natural interaction, we will have to be able to handle these different approaches. In this work, what we propose is to learn from a lot of categories, to learn convolutional neural nets, to learn several thousands of classifiers on one hand, but also rely in instant matching to be able to recognize specific products or specific brands or logos from Google Image Search or IQ Engine. This is how bottles look in ImageNet, and there are a lot of variations and a lot of different kinds, but they look very different in how bottles look in Google Image Search. So we hope that we can combine both sources of information to get more robust and get better performance. So the general idea is like giving us an image when we have different candidate windows, we will run through object recognition to get different categories, through instance matching to get different matchings with the brands and logos, and then we will project into a textual space where we can compare with the query done by the user. By doing that, we will be able to rank all the different candidates and be able to choose what is the target that the user is referring to. For doing that, we will need to have a method that generates different candidate proposals. And also here you can see some of the results given by these 7,000 convolutional neural nets. And here you can see some of the results of the Google Image Search. So those can complement each other and be able to recognize, in some cases, brands, and other cases, categories. Here is a really more detailed view, and as you can see in the green boxes, in some cases the category matching is performing better, in other cases the instance matching is performing better. So in this work, what we did is we combined both using a cascade model that runs first the instance matching because it tends to be more precise, and then on top of that it runs a category matching because it has better coverage. For generating the proposals, we use selective search, but we are exploring other methods to do that. Let me go in a little bit more detail how we make this projecting into a textual space is by taking one of these images and generating a set of words associated with those images. Those words came from the instance matching retrieval, where we get a lot of web pages, and also from the description from WordNet for the categories we recognize the object belong to. We conducted several experiments using household objects and asked users to describe those objects and refer to one of them, and the system has to choose which one is the target object referring by those. So we compare with several baselines methods, and here you can see the results using instance-based methods only. Then you can see how the category-based methods perform in different settings. And then at the bottom, you can see how the combined method is able to perform better than any of the methods above, and how the cascade method that we propose in the paper is able to obtain the best performance. We also analyze how the different way to refer to the objects have impact in performance. So when people tend to use category labels or instance label, you get different performance. As expected, instance-based methods perform better when you refer by instances. Category-based methods perform better when you use categories. But when we combine both together, we are able to get good on both sizes. So our cascade method is able to perform nearly like 76% in instances and 62% in categories. So for more details, come to see my poster outside and our demo in Sutarda Hall today. Thank you very much.
The focus of my research is state representation learning, but you can really think about it as learning perception, learning to extract the right information from sensory input. And our brain is incredibly good at that. The sensory input in your eyes alone is about 250 million dimensional. But still, we are able to somehow reduce this complexity and extract the right information in order to do all the things humans are capable of doing. Another way to look at this problem is learning features. And Andrew Ng just gave a great talk about how this can be done using deep learning approaches. Our approach is orthogonal to that one. The problem of feature learning is considered really hard and really important in the machine learning community. Pedro Domingos even calls it the holy grail of machine learning. So let's see what we can do about that. First of all, we want to approach this problem in a robotic-specific way. And robots don't have to learn features from passively observing the world. Robots can move around, they can touch things, they can interact with the world. And this should greatly simplify the problem. More importantly, robots interact with our world, which we know about. So the interaction between the robot and the world is structured by the laws of physics. And really the key idea of our approach is to use prior knowledge about interacting with the physical world. But how exactly are we doing that? Well, we have a robot and it's interacting with the physical world. So it's receiving observations and also a reward signal telling it what to do. The robot is performing actions in order to achieve its task, and it's then trying to map the observations into an internal state representation that captures the right information that it needs in order to pick the actions. And as the state corresponds to what's going on in the real world, the same laws that apply in the real world must also apply in its internal state representation. For example, Newton's laws of motion. So Newton's second law says that force equals mass times acceleration. If we now assume that the actions of a robot correspond to applying certain forces by, for example, pushing something, then the outcome must be proportional to these forces. So also, the resulting state change following an action must be proportional to the action. We implemented this and 4 other robotic priors in our method. And they basically form the learning objective. So we're really trying to learn a representation that's consistent with these priors. And even though the priors are very simple and you can find counterexamples for each of them, they're still highly useful because they capture the overall structure of interaction. We evaluated this in several experiments, but due to the problem difficulty, we have to start with really basic tasks in simulation. So I want to show you one of these experiments, which is a robot navigation task. With a robot, you can see there, and its goal is to navigate to a certain location in this room. But apart from the robot, there are also distractors moving around during the task that influence the observation of the robot, but not the task itself. So you can think of them as distracting objects moving around in your visual perception. This is the robot's view of the scene. It's taken through a wide-angle lens camera of the robot, but it's really getting a low-resolution version of this image. It then just tries random actions and interacts with the world, and using our method learns to map these 300-dimensional sensory input into a low-dimensional state representation. We now want to test the utility of the state representation by looking at how quickly this allows the robot to learn the task. So what we did is applied a standard reinforcement learning method based on different state representations and compared how quickly the robot was able to solve the task. To see how quickly the robot can optimally learn to solve the task, we performed reinforcement learning on the ground truth robot pose. And this is the learning curve that you would get for that. This is considered the optimal representation for that. If instead we run reinforcement learning, the same method, on the raw visual input, you see that learning, of course, is much slower. We also compare against other methods that try to learn representations of a sensory input, but that don't take into account the whole interactive loop, but only look at the observations. And we see that they don't benefit learning the task much. Compared to that, our method allows the robot to learn the task as quickly as based on the ground truth robot pose. So that means that in this example, the learned representation was as good as the best omniscient state representation that we as humans could think of. Okay, so I hope I made you a bit curious. My name is Rico Jonschkowski, and if you want to hear more about this, for example, about the other 4 priors, or want to see what this representation actually looks like, please see me at my poster, I2. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Chaohui Gong from Carnegie Mellon University. Today I'm going to talk about a technique called the conditioned basis array factorization, which is a technique can be applied to multidimensional data array for the purpose for identifying a low-dimensional analytical representation of the original data. We demonstrate the application of this technique onto motion capture data from biological snake for deriving useful motions and behaviors for our snake robot. So our research group has been building these high-degree freedom complicated snake robots for over 15 years. As we start being successfully building several generations of these mechanisms, we start more concerned about designing and planning motions for using these mechanisms for useful applications in like urban search and rescue. However, as you can imagine, because of the high dimensionality associated with the system, it is very difficult to either modeling the locomotion or planning motion for such system. So we are very limited by the availability of computational tool to plan like useful behaviors for such system. So recently we turned our attention into biology, and when we were making observation on these sidewinding rattlesnake, what we observed is these animals are extremely capable of elegantly manipulate their body to generate effective motion on complicated environments. So we ask ourselves, is that possible for us to learn something useful by observing how these animals move? So as our collaborator, the biologists, are playing around with these venomous snakes, what we observed is actually this sidewinder rattlesnake uses no-slip static contact to locomote. By that means this friction imposes some approximately non-holonomic constraint to the system, such that the internal shape changes of these biological snakes can be transferred into net displacement in an almost deterministic fashion. So by that, it means if we are able to capture, represent, and parameterize these internal shape changes in a very concise fashion, we should be able to generate useful behaviors for our snake robot. So driven by this idea, we set up a motion capture system at Zoo Atlanta. What we did is we put several IR markers on the back of the snake. We try to extract the shape information of these biological snakes. So what we do is we put these IR markers at different locations of the back of the snake to estimate the local shape information. We estimate these shape information at different time steps across a Gait cycle, and we collect all these data out of a variety of different animal behaviors. So all the motion capture data would be represented as a multidimensional array showed here. So now we have the data, but we need to derive something or learn something using these data. So in order to concisely and intuitively look at these data, what we proposed is a method called the condition basis array factorization, which uses analytical basis function to perform array factorization. Basically, it does is try to find a low-dimensional, concise analytical representation of the original data. So using this method, what we achieved is an analytical equation representing all the observed motion, which contains only 2 model parameters, which means all the observed motion can be reasoned by only adjusting these 2 parameters. So with this equation, we were able to generate joint trajectories for our robot to either mimicking the observed biological motion, or we can search or explore in that parameter space looking for novel modes of locomotion. I need to stress this method not only give us a equation, it also helps us to intuitively look at the data and gain some intuition and understanding like how limbless locomotion works. And the final result is an exceptional level of maneuverability. So if you are interested, please stop by my poster. Thank you for your attention.
All right, we have time for a couple questions. It's really hard to see, so yes.
Can you talk about the behavior of basis?
The question was, can you say something more about the behavior of the basis functions?
Yes, so as I said, this method uses some analytical basis function for this specific application and considering its limbless undulatory locomotion. So we use Fourier basis for the temporal variation and for the spatial variation. But for the behavior, because we don't have good intuition and understanding, so we actually use an PCA-like technique to automatically identify these basis function purely based on the data. So if we have good understanding like how the amplitude of the motion is varying across different behaviors, we might start leveraging some different types of basis function. And we indeed have some thoughts about like have a larger set of different basis function as candidate and doing some like entropy measure or other metric try to automatically choose which basis set will be the best candidate.
Was the experiment done on real robots? Was the experiment done on real robots or on simulated data?
So far we have only done experiments in simulation, but we are doing right now also trying to implement it on a real robot.
Thank you.
All right, great. Let's thank these speakers and move on to the next step.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about online trajectory planning for surgical task automation. As you know, robotic surgery has been spreading worldwide, and surgical task automation is one of possible advancements of robotic surgery. And automation can reduce the physical and mental fatigue of surgeons. However, trajectory planning for surgical task automation is a difficult problem. So let me suppose a knot tying in surgical operation. In a knot tying, surgeons need to make a loop around the instrument with a thread held by other instrument. And in this motion, the trajectory has to be planned according to the relative position of two instruments. And in addition, if the target instrument is moving, the trajectory has to be planned and updated online. And learning from demonstration approach is often used for surgical task automation because it enables to learn the feature of the task implicitly. However, the generalization of demonstrated trajectory to new situation in real time is a hard problem. Although there are some works related to the generalization of demonstrated trajectories, they are not applied to online trajectory planning in dynamic situation because of the limitation in computational cost. So in this study, we aim to generate the trajectory in real time to perform the task under a dynamic environment. And for this purpose, we propose a scheme by learning from demonstrations under various conditions. And this is the overview of the proposed scheme. And in the offline phase, the demonstrations were performed under the various conditions. And using the data set, the distribution of the trajectory over the condition is modeled. In the offline phase, the trajectory for the new condition is estimated as the conditional expectations. And then the system is controlled to track the planned trajectory. And I'd like to explain the concept of the proposed scheme. And here, let me suppose a task in which the instrument makes a loop around the other instrument. And I'd like to start with the static environment at first. And the problem is how to plan the trajectory under the given configurations. And if the demonstrations are performed under various configurations, we can have the set of the configurations and the trajectory. And using the data set, we can compute the mapping from the configuration to the trajectory. And for this purpose, we use the Gaussian process regressions. And if we can compute the joint distribution of the configurations and trajectories, the trajectory for a new situation can be estimated as the conditional expectations. And as you know, the Gaussian process regression requires optimization of hyperparameters. However, once the hyperparameters are optimized in the offline phase, the computational cost required for the online trajectory planning is relatively low. So this feature enables to plan the trajectory in a short time. So when the target instrument is moving like this, the scheme I mentioned enables planning the trajectory at each time step as shown here. And the problem is how to control the systems to track the planned trajectory smoothly and stably. And for this purpose, I employ the sliding mode control, and it enables to plan and determine the control input such that the system tracks the trajectory smoothly and stably. And the proposed scheme was verified through experiments and simulations using the robotics surgical system shown here. And task was performed under various configurations. And using the data set, the distribution of the trajectory were modeled using the Gaussian process regression. And this is a demonstrations of the online trajectory planning. And in this task, the position of the left instrument was disturbed, and the system successfully adapted their motions. The system updated trajectory every 120 milliseconds. And this is a visualization of the planned trajectories. The system updated trajectory in response to the motion of the left instrument. And the system also learned the task in which the instrument pick and pull the surgical needle held by other instrument. And although the position of the surgical needle was disturbed, the system successfully adopted its motion. And here is, again, the visualization of the planned trajectories. So as you can see here, the system updated trajectory in response to the motion of the surgical instrument. So I'd like to explain the details if you come to my poster. Thank you for attention.
All right, I'm Tanner Schmidt, and I'll be talking about DART, or Dense Articulated Real-Time Tracking, and this is work I did with Richard Newcomb and Dieter Fox up at the University of Washington. So the problem we're trying to solve is, can we track any arbitrary articulated model in real time with one depth camera? And a lot of groups have developed really great trackers, but focused on just one specific model. So we really wanted to focus on this general purpose tracker that can track any model with a very simple algorithm. So just for some very quick background, Fitzgibbon was sort of the first to show the value of using pre-computed distance transforms to make ICP alignment, rigid in his case, really fast. And later, Connect Fusion, which used sign distance functions for its map, showed us the value of dense and real-time optimization. So DART's about bringing together articulated models such as those used by Gresta al. and others with this SDF-based, really fast GPU optimization. So in DART, models are represented just as a set of coordinate frames in a kinematic tree, and then we have a pose vector which fully describes the position and articulation of the models, where the first 6 parameters describe the translation and rotation of the root, and then all of our other transforms are defined recursively through our tree structure according to the articulation parameters, so everything after the first 6. Then we attach rigid geometry to the local frames, and we pre-compute a implicit surface representation in the form of a sign distance function for each frame. And then we have a global model SDF, which is just the composition of all these local SDFs, and we can see a vertical slice of that here. And note that the level sets of this change according to the articulation of the model. So now I'll describe the tracking algorithm. So we start with a 3D point cloud and an initial model estimate, which we usually just get from the last frame. And then we first transform every observed point into every SDF. And through a very easy SDF lookup, we can determine which part of the model each point should be associated with. And the SDFs very readily give us an error also to be minimized, and the gradients that we use then to minimize that error. So you can think of this as like a really efficient articulated ICP. But each frame also gives us so-called negative information, which tells us not only where the model is, but also where it isn't. And we can encode this information implicitly in what we call the observation SDF. And you can see a rendering of the 0-level set of that SDF here. And then we can use our generative model to generate a predicted point cloud for each new articulation. And then we can use basically the same error and the same gradients except where the model and the observation have now been switched. And the result is this really nicely symmetric objective function where we're just balancing the observation to model error and then the model to observation error using a balancing parameter. And importantly, this is a pixel-wise independent error function, so we can optimize it very efficiently just using gradient descent implemented on the GPU. And then as new frames come in, we just keep doing the optimization, starting at where we were from the last frame. So we evaluated DART on a couple publicly available data sets. So this is a hand tracking data set, and I'll also show you a human data set soon. And the only thing we had to change was the model that we're using to track. So this hand model here has 26 degrees of freedom, and the human model you'll see in a minute has 48. So we found that we were able to beat sort of existing state-of-the-art methods on both data sets and came very close to results that were just published at CVPR last month. But remember that those are specific trackers, and we were able to compete with them while being completely general, and we didn't even have like temporal smoothing or anything like that. So you can see here, we also tracked the Rethink Robotics Baxter robot and articulated objects such as this 8-degree of freedom cardboard box. And even though we weren't doing modeling of physical constraints, we were able to keep tracking the box as Baxter slides it across the table and opens it up. We also did a visual surveying experiment, which I'll be happy to talk to you about at the interactive session. So yeah, just to conclude, with Dart, we found that really efficient model representation using negative information and really fast GPU optimization allows us to track arbitrary articulated models in real time and all with the same code, which, by the way, we plan to release in the near future, and we think it'll be useful for human activity recognition, natural user interfaces, and like robotic proprioception and visual surveying. So thank you.
All right, let's take some questions. Oh, they're in the back.
Touching on robot surgery, can you say more about these?
Oh, thank you. On the robot surgery, can you say more about the robots you're using and how they might differ from, say, the intuitive Da Vinci?
So the robot we used is, we are developing our surgical robot in our lab, and it's very similar to Da Vinci. There's no big difference.
Other questions?
So for speaker number 2, are you estimating only the relative positions of the bodies in the articulated body, or are you also trying to estimate the global position of the body within space?
The global as well, so the full global and then all the joints as well, yeah. Yep.
So for speaker number 3, do you explicitly model occlusions at all in your work, or how does it deal with occlusions?
That's a good question. So we don't explicitly model occlusions, and that's sort of where this negative information I was talking about comes in. So you can imagine in situations where if you're tracking a hand and you're seeing it from the side, where a lot of your hand is occluded and basically your degrees of freedom are under-constrained, the negative information ensures that even though we haven't observed those fingers, that we know if they had been out of place, that we would have predicted that those points would lie there, and we'd be able to minimize that error using our observation SDF.
Down here in front.
Also for the first speaker, how do you track visual positions?
And can you repeat the question just for the benefit of everyone?
Okay, so the question is how to track the instrument. In the second experiment, so in the first experiment, we can get the position kinematically. So we can get the joint angle from the controllers, and then we just computed the position kinematically. And in the second experiment, we tracked the position of the instrument visually, so using a KLT tracker, and then we triangulate the position.
And I see a question here near the aisle.
For speaker 2, I was curious if you know how your approach for generating particles compares to that of mixture MCL or mixture Monte Carlo localization?
No, we haven't done any further study on that, but we can maybe talk afterwards.
Okay.
Great. Well, let's thank our speakers.